Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring a very timely topic that's best illustrated by the way in which companies have reacted to the recent invasion of Ukraine. What we've seen is businesses taking steps to engage with the public mood. Some have ceased doing business in or with Russia or Russian clients. Others have provided humanitarian support to refugees or practical help to the Ukrainian government. This desire to respond to the situation has forced businesses to effectively take a political position. Now, that's something that most companies would have historically tried to avoid. In most cases, they'd have wanted to remain apolitical for fear of offending someone. But that's no longer acceptable. And that's what my guest, Joe Zammit Lucia, has just written a book about. In The New Political Capitalism, How Business and Societies Can Thrive in a Deeply Politicized World, Joe explores how modern businesses need to reflect the social values and cultural trends which shape the environment in which businesses operate, and how an incredibly politicized set of stakeholders, everyone from customers to employees and investors, are increasingly expecting companies to have a perspective on political issues. In our discussion, Joe explains to me why companies should and need to get involved in political issues, what that means for the way they're run. I think Joe's ideas are absolutely fascinating, and as I said at the start, incredibly timely. I should add that we recorded this before the invasion of Ukraine took place, which is why there's no reference to it in our conversation. With that said, please enjoy my conversation with Joe Zammit Lucia on the politics of business. Joe, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you. It's great being here, and I love the subject matter of your podcast around human decision making. So it's very fascinating. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I'm so thrilled that you're here, and we'll come on and talk about the specific thing that grabbed my attention when I first discovered you. But in the meantime, can you just give my listeners a little bit of sense of who you are and your background and what you do?
So I have a low boredom threshold. So every so often I change what I do. I change careers. I change things what I do. So I trained originally as a doctor, as a physician, as a gastroenterologist, and practiced medicine for a little bit. And then I went into business. I went to work for multinational pharmaceutical companies and got into a different way of thinking, a business way of thinking. Then I set up my own business, which was a strategic advisory firm that advised in the healthcare field, advised multinational companies, but that got me into the policy arena. And then I sold the business and went sailing for a while. And then I decided that I kind of thought that there were two big forces that kind of almost define the kind of society we live in. And one was business, which has a big impact, and the other was politics. And I knew a little bit about business, having spent quite a bit of time in that, and nothing about politics. So I got into the political arena a little bit and got involved in that, and that exposed me to yet another different way of thinking. And I was fascinated by the fundamental differences in worldviews, ways of thinking, and decision-making, in fact, in the political arena as opposed to the business arena. And that's what stimulated me to get into writing this book.
The way you came to my attention was on, as ever with these things, fascinating thing on LinkedIn, and it was talking about business and politics. And what fascinates me about that is, on the one hand, we clearly know that lots of companies, there's a lot of dark money influencing companies and lobbying and all those sorts of things, and companies influencing politicians and things go. But there is this sort of implicit rule that the company should steer clear of politics, right? Don't be seen to be taken because that feels dangerous. Mm-hmm. And yeah, companies are clearly regulated and governed. And so it's natural for them to want to get involved in and influence that. But also, many things that happen to companies require them to take a position. So you might try and duck something, but particularly now, if we look at some of the prevalent subjects, it seems to be more and more in companies' interests and expected of them that they will start to take positions, which can feel a little bit uncomfortable. Can you talk about this sort of tension and how you see the world changing there?
Yes. So, we live in, most of us here who are listening to this podcast live.
Yeah, my North Korean audience isn't that great.
Okay, right. live in.
They don't show up in the stats. Maybe they are listening. I don't know.
No. Okay, well, we'll see. I haven't yet been invited to North Korea. So most of us live in capitalist societies and capitalist democracies. And, capitalism has been resilient because it has changed with the times. So, we've had feudal capitalism. Some people don't call that capitalism because there wasn't a free market in labor. But anyway, let's pass that over. Then we had mercantilist capitalism, industrial capitalism, consumerist capitalism, the post-war era. And what we've had in these past sort of 30, 50 years, since the 80s, I guess, 70s, 80s, 90s, is what I call financialized capitalism, where everything was reduced to money. And the only thing that was valued was that can be measured in dollars or pounds or euros or yen or whatever. And corporations and companies in a system of financialized capitalism get a particular view of themselves, of what they are there for. And in financialized capitalism, the idea is that companies are there to make money. They're there to create or increase shareholder value. And that's not what business is about. The purpose of business is not to make money. Making money is a consequence of doing something useful. So, I remember once I was in a meeting in a pharmaceutical company with the commercial people and the R&D people, and the R&D people were presenting their scientific ideas of what they were doing, what they were thinking of doing or planning to do. And one of the commercial people got bored after a while and piped up and said, well, this is all very fascinating scientifically, but you guys seem to forget that we're here to make money. And the president of R&D, who was a wise old Scotsman, turned to the guy and said, laddie, we're not here to make money. We're here to make medicines that make people better. And if we can do that well, then we'll make money. So, but that sort of common sense idea seems to have disappeared during this period of financialized capitalism. But that period, in my view, is coming to an end. And we're entering a period of what I call political capitalism, where we start to talk about much more about corporate purpose. We start to see and understand that companies actually have an impact on the society we live in, and they're expected to have a good impact, not a bad impact. And political issues in the broadest sense, and by political I mean addressing the question of what type of society do we want to live in. That is what I define as politics. How we collectively make decisions about what sort of society we want to live in. Not party politics, that's just a kind of the mechanism. But politics is about, how do we want to live and how do we make those decisions collectively? And companies have, during this period of financialized capitalism, believed that they were apolitical. Politics has nothing to do with me. Politics should keep out of my way so that I can keep doing business. That period that was always simplistic, as you
right, because you pay taxes and you've got regulations.
You pay taxes, you lobby,
right in some cases.
You lobby, you try to influence regulation. There's all this sort of stuff. So the idea of politics keeping out of my way so I can do business has always been a bit nonsensical, or very nonsensical even. But now it's coming to the fore. Companies are now expected increasingly to explicitly take part in the broad political process. And they're increasingly affected by it, from whether they invest in China, whether they get their parts, whether they get their routers or their microchips from China and what national security implications that has, from big issues like that to other more parochial issues like board diversity and issues like that. So there's a whole span of what I call political issues that companies cannot afford not to get involved in anymore.
And implicitly, it's the way you were talking about it, even if you thought you were steering clear of it, you were implicitly, to your point about your supply chain, implicitly you are taking a position on things. So this has always, to some extent, been there. But what you seem to be saying, correct me where this is wrong, is it's much more visible now. And there's a greater, I guess society has kind of picked that up and is running with that a bit more. And therefore, there's an expectation that you'll do it. So you may have been doing it without realizing it in the past. Now you absolutely have to.
Yes. So, lots of things have changed. First of all, we've realized that this idea of creating shareholder value, fair enough, but not all shareholder value is created. Some shareholder value is just transferred. So if a company pollutes, it's actually taking value out of the environment and converting that to financial value. If a company, decides to withdraw from a particular country or a particular place and fires 1,000 people, then it's taking value out of social capital and converting that into profit. So not all financial value is created. Some of it is being transferred, what economists call, negative externalities. And, there's an increasing realization there. I think what has changed is that it's not that these things were not there, it's just the priority that we gave them. So in an age of financialized capitalism, a lot more was tolerated and accepted because the ultimate aim of delivering financial value reigned supreme. So if you had in your supply chain slave labor in Africa or in Vietnam or whatever, okay, but that's cheap labor and it creates financial value for me and my shareholders and whatever, so it's acceptable. Besides the fact that quite often we didn't know about it. So we now have a combination of much increased transparency, a much more active civil society that is bringing these issues up to visibility, and what I would call a socio-cultural political climate that finds these things no longer acceptable. So they can no longer be, that's the way it is. You now have to do something about them. This has been coming for some time, but change is slow and, it's not linear. And now it's bubbling. And in my view, over the next 10, 15, 20 years, we'll see dramatic changes.
And so really you're saying companies need to, so you have to address this now. It's there. So if you want to run a sustainable business, you're going to have to address this particular issue. And that, of course, is terrifying if you have run your business on the basis of either willful blindness to it, or let's be charitable, not really thinking about it. Suddenly you're stuck with what can, I guess, in some cases, particularly if you've got a real legacy business, that almost it's not directly linear, but almost the older the business, the more this is likely to be a challenge because you've been around for some time, and I guess ignoring the issue for a long period of time, and therefore a lot of things in your DNA about how you do things may well fall foul of this particular challenge. In other words, you're going to have to make some radical changes.
Absolutely. I think you've put it quite right there. It's not willful blindness. It's the fact that people form a perception of who they are and their ego and what constitutes success in their job, dependent on the culture in which they live, they're brought up, they're educated. And if, like me, you had started your business career in the 80s and 90s, then what you were told, the culture you had to live in, was that, making money, maximizing profits and shareholder value was the whole purpose of business. So people defined themselves by that. And it was reasonable. That's what everybody was told. That's what we were all told. Now that's changing. And, change, Some people say that change is the word that causes the greatest anxiety among people. But change is a constant, as we know. And companies and individual business leaders, will split like they always do. Some will resist it and say, this is a bunch of nonsense, I'm not playing. I'm just going to carry on as I am. Others will be dragged kicking and screaming. Others will say, okay, I'll move along with this, but not too fast. Others will say, hey, this is big change, and it can give me big competitive advantage if I'm ahead of the game. Business is not monolithic. So, there's lots of different businesses, lots of different business leaders, lots of businesses of different sizes that this will affect in different ways. So, there will be adaptation with leaders and laggards, just like there has always been.
And it struck me as you were talking about sort of things that might have seemed acceptable because that's the way the world was. Well, at least that's the excuse that's you. It struck me if we look at sort of empires, for example, and I'm sat here in London, so the British Empire immediately comes to mind. And that was a model that I can look at it one way and say, well, it's bringing civilization to countries that had none. The alternative story is ripping natural resources out, slavery, and a whole load of other unpleasantries. Mm-hmm. And so we saw that as a sort of business model. The East India Company would be a good example of a company that sort of, it sounds very civil. And then you look at some of the things that those sorts of companies had practiced. And of course, those things died out, or the organizations that were using those practices shifted something else. It's a similar thing that's happening now, you're saying.
Yes. It's another evolution. It's another change. And, I think it's difficult. And I think we should be careful about judging and condemning people who lived at a different time, when certain things were the way the world worked. It's very easy for us to look back and saying how shameful what they did in the British Empire, but that was how the world worked then. The world has moved on, and who knows, in 50 years' time, people will look at what you and I are doing and say, wasn't that shameful? So let's not get too arrogant about all this. But the world changes, and people adapt, and companies adapt, and organizations adapt, and they adapt at different speeds. And those who adapt well thrive, and those who don't die out. I mean, nothing new about any of that.
And so as you've looked at this topic, you've highlighted the fact that this is the word change can be challenging, and I guess, to your point, is depending on where your roots are, how long you've been around, this will either be easy for you, either practically or psychologically, or it could be very, very challenging. What are your thoughts and advice to people that are sort of grappling with this? So the ones that don't want to recognize it, fine, they're almost a lost cause for the moment. But people that want to make that shift, what's your sort of thoughts and advice into how to handle that? Because as you say, this could, in extremis, this could be a thing. The way you're currently doing business is not acceptable anymore and is going to die out. You need to fundamentally change.
Yes.
And that's quite terrifying, particularly if you're sitting on quite a lucrative business.
Yes. So the first thing I think is it is going to be a challenge, because we're now talking about things that are soft. Their values, there's no hard answer. There's no right or wrong to almost any of it. Politics is ever shifting. Culture is ever shifting. It's not, you can't address these questions by putting numbers on a spreadsheet and seeing what number comes out at the bottom. Okay? So that was the age of financialized capitalism. So now it's all about values. It's all about, what am I about? What is my business about? It's very soft stuff, and ever shifting stuff, shifting sands. And that makes many people in business uncomfortable, and rightly so, because it's difficult. But there are things that you can start to look at. So, for instance, you can even start to change your language. So, a lot of businesses talk about consumers. Okay, which consumers do we go after? Well, okay, let's talk about the word consumers. It assumes that the only value that a human being has is his or her ability to consume, preferably endlessly. Now, we're getting past that, and I think people are behaving more like citizens. They have responsibilities. They care about the society we live in. They care about the environment. They care about the climate. So even starting, how would a citizen feel about my product or service and how I do business is different to talking about, how many bars of chocolate are the consumers going to buy? So changing language like that already starts to make you think in a different way. Another approach is that most leadership perspectives in companies look at the world from the inside out. So you're inside an organization, and it doesn't have to be a corporation, it could be any big organization. You're inside an organization and you're looking at the world outwards. So if you're a CEO of a large quoted company, in the age of financialized capitalism, your first customer that you look at were the financial markets. What's going to happen to my stock price? And then you say, okay, if I want to push up my stock price, what kind of organization do I need? What kind of things do I need to deliver? And how do I deliver them profitably? And then you look further outwards and you say, okay, now I've got that. How do I fit in with my general environment? Okay, so you're looking from the inside out. If you start looking from the outside in, you get a totally different picture. If you start from saying, what kind of world do we live in and what kind of world do we want to live in? And what are the expectations of that world, of my business and my corporation? How do I then organize myself to meet those expectations and to deliver value to that society? And then, how do I do that profitably? How do I do that in a way that I can be profitable and grow my business? So instead of looking from the inside out, you start looking from the outside in. And it might seem a simple thing to do, but it actually gives you a totally different perspective on your, on what your business is about. The other thing I think that's worth keeping in mind is that business is about efficiency and has been about efficiency. And when people make decisions in business, they say, okay, I want to get from place A to place B. Draw me as straight a line as possible to get from place A to place B. And then let's get a speedboat and go from place A to place B quickly and efficiently. And that's a linear way of thinking. Society and the political, again, in the broadest sense, world doesn't progress like that. It progresses more like a sailing boat in a storm. It tacks this way and that, dependent on the political winds. Sometimes it gets pushed backwards a little bit. Sometimes it takes on water and seems as though it's going to... But the direction of travel is clear, but it's not neat and linear. It's messy and almost chaotic and tacking this way and that. And getting used to making decisions in that environment as opposed to the nice, linear, straight line, efficient environment is a challenge. But, there are ways and approaches that it can be done, but it's different from how it has been.
Wow. I mean, all of those things fascinating because it's a real shift in mental model and how you perceive the world and therefore your behavior off the back of that perception. And it occurred to me that if you were a private company, then you have the luxury of being able to do this without the glare of things like quarterly reporting. And of course, one of the reasons that we have this short-term thinking is that, and stock price driven remuneration is because people are remunerated on that basis. So how can you see people who are being assessed on a short-term basis, who could lose their jobs in the short term? They might make a decision that long-term is the right one, but the short-term incentives and literally their ability to fulfill it because they might get fired is heavily undermined by this short-termist quarterly reporting mentality.
Yes. It's a big challenge. It's not just, it is, as you rightly say, this quarter-on-quarter numbers. It is the fact that, senior executive pay since the 1980s or so has become linked primarily to stock price performance, which in my view has been very destructive, and all the other things that have created this short-term culture. And that's going to take time to change, but I think we're seeing change. We're seeing, first of all, a lot of public companies being taken private through, the mountain of private equity money that there is out there. Now, private equity, again, is not homogeneous. Some private equity is crash and burn as much as anything else. Others have longer term horizons. Everybody has different objectives. But the John Kay wrote a report under the coalition government around how to overcome short-termism, and he came to the conclusion that it's very difficult because a lot of it is cultural. But the culture is changing, and the incentives will change over time, and we will find ways of giving people more longer term incentives, etc. The challenge with incentives, I think, as you know, the good thing about incentives is that they work. The bad thing about incentives is that they work. And if you have very narrow incentives, as opposed to broad incentives, if you have very narrow incentives, you end up being forced into perverse behavior because you're just chasing one or two outcomes, and all the other things which might be important kind of fall by the wayside. So, the incentive system is going to have to change and maybe become more complex and pull people. When I had my own business, we had an incentive structure for the staff that purposely had incentives that pulled them in opposite directions. So if you went too far to the left, you got penalized because there are incentives to the right. You didn't meet your incentives to the right. If you went too far to the right, you got penalized because you didn't meet your incentives to the left. So then they had to make judgments and they had to balance.
So can you just give us an example of that? Because I think that's fascinating.
Right. So I'll give you a specific example. I was in a consulting business. So, it was the only asset we had was people's intelligence, people's capability, and people's time. So we had just one simple example. We had an incentive system that said, you had to have a certain proportion of your time as billable hours. Okay. But the other incentive was that by design, all our projects were fixed budget projects. And you were penalized if you went over budget. So you couldn't just put time into a project to put up your billable hours because you'd fall foul of going over budget. So you had to try and find the right balance for yourself. So the incentives were pulling people in opposite directions, which meant that they had to make their own judgments and they had to find their own balance. And that I think is where we need to get to, that we have a broad incentive system that makes people realize that life is a balance of many things. It's not just one thing.
And I think that's really interesting because very often companies have objectives, or organizations even have objectives that, as you say, there will come a time where there's a conflict, and that might be profitability versus safety, or profitability versus environmental footprint, or some sort of, and they state all these things out there. And you're absolutely right, is that your profitability will be there at the moment under the current system in many companies, profitability, and then the other ones are sort of nice to have. If you can also do those, that'd be great.
Yes.
Without recognizing that, as you say, there are times when these things come under huge amounts of tension, and you're going to have to make a judgment call between, if I cut a bit of a corner here on the safety thing, I can make more money. Therefore, I'll go with the making money thing over the safety piece. And that and almost actually recognizing that life is a bit complicated and that life is a series of trade-offs and that there aren't perfect business decisions. that will magically tick all of the boxes. And if there are, they're probably causing some unintended consequences elsewhere. So I really like that idea, because what you're doing is moving away from something that's frankly unrealistic, which is, let's have that chart. Let's make sure the numbers always go up. If they keep going up, you're doing it into something that says, well, hey, I like your sailing analogy. Back sometimes we're gonna go backwards a little bit to go forwards.
Yes. And this kind of tick box culture and this management by objectives and management by incentives has undermined what is most important, which is human judgment. I don't have to make any judgments anymore, because I know that which boxes I need to tick and how. And that, I think, is very dangerous. And it's just not very pleasant either. So I think we need to move back to the idea that people have to balance many things and make judgments. And sometimes they go backwards, as you say, or they have to tack to the left in order to get to the right later when the things change. I mean, to take your example of safety, in the book, I cover the story of Boeing and the 737 MAX, where, they clearly cut a lot of corners. And it resulted in 2 crashes where hundreds of people lost their lives. And they didn't spend the money on that, while they were spending hundreds and hundreds of millions on stock buybacks. Now, it's all very well to say how terrible, but therefore the grace of God, go all of us, because that's the way the incentive systems are set up, and that's the way the culture was. And this is not just a question which applies to business. I mean, if you take regulators, as I mentioned, I used to be in the pharmaceutical business. Now, if you're a pharmaceutical regulator, you get castigated if you allow onto the market a new product that eventually has safety issues and damages people. So you're incentivized to be hyper cautious. You're not, on the other hand, castigated if you delay by 2 years a product that could have saved lots of people's lives. So, we all have to find that balance. It's not just a question of business. It happens in the regulatory and political world too.
And implicit in that is that people are going to make mistakes. And we know that we all do.
Yes.
There are certain politicians who claim never to have ever made a mistake, but the rest of us, normal human mortals, do. And I'm fascinated by that, because clearly implicit in what you're suggesting is that we need to have a greater willingness to accept that humans are fallible. Because this tacking and changing and getting things wrong and potentially shifting away from this perfect, look how I made the stock price go up world into one where it's much less volatile, requires us to shift our perspective and the way we look at these things. And I'm intrigued as to how you think we do that, because there is this narrative of idiots make mistakes. And so that's why we get cover-ups and embarrassment, because people are worried about losing their jobs, because if they make too many mistakes, that's it for them. And so that drives a lot of this dynamic. How do we make that shift that is clearly necessary given what you've outlined?
Yes. It's very hard, because you're right. We've developed a very unforgiving culture, not just in business, but also in politics. I mean, when did you last see a political headline in a newspaper that said, oh, well, the government made that decision 3 years ago. It didn't quite work out, but hey, well done for trying. Okay? That's not how we report on politics. That's not how the media reports. We're all too quick to castigate, and we're all too quick to judge, and that culture has spread and become very prevalent. And we somehow, I don't know how, but we somehow need to find a way back from that. I mean, people used to say, you only learn from your mistakes. If you've never made a mistake, you probably haven't achieved very much.
Right. But I find it fascinating because if you look at, and I'll pick an example here in the UK, right? So you've got Boris Johnson and government saying, we made all the right calls on X. And that is, and it's quite, let's assume that is correct, right? That the outcome was, and I think it was debatable, but we can, But what's interesting about that is that clearly that's heavily outcome biased, which is to say that you're looking at it as to how did it turn out rather than what was the quality of the decision making in the first place.
Right.
And so there's a lens that is completely flawed, which is incredibly unhelpful in the sense of what you're talking about. And I suspect there are probably other lenses that we can think of, narratives, if you like, that we have got used to hearing and probably looking for ourselves in both ourselves and other people that are fundamentally unhelpful when it comes to the sort of shifts you're talking about.
Yes, and this is not new. I mean, decision scientists have have talked about this for a long time, that you can't judge decisions by their outcome. You have to judge decisions by whether you made the best possible decision, giving the information you had at the time.
Right, otherwise the drunkard in the casino who gets lucky is a genius.
Yes, exactly. So did people make the best possible decision given the information and the uncertainty that they had at the time? Whether it worked out or not is totally separate from whether it was a good decision. But again, all this is forgotten, and all this is kind of being swept away, and we only judge on the basis of outcomes, which is not helpful. It's and the other thing about you say we made all the right calls. Nobody knows, and nobody can possibly know ever whether they were the right call. But the other thing is that all those calls were inevitably surrounded by huge amounts of uncertainty, because the data were uncertain. We didn't know anything about these damn viruses. It was a huge amount of uncertainty. So there's decision making under huge uncertainty. And again, we've developed a culture where we believe we can eliminate uncertainty, where, find me the facts and let's make the decision based on the facts. Well, there are no facts about the future by definition. We only have facts about the past. So when you're making future-facing decisions, you can't have facts.
And as you're talking, I'm struck by the leadership models that we have, both in terms of the stereotypical strong leader, those sorts of, and the sorts of people that we have in those positions. I mean, historically, because of privilege and a lack of diversity and inclusion, we've had there's been a prevalence of a certain type of leadership. And clearly, we are moving in the right direction in terms of getting other people there. But we are some way off to having what you might term a proper diversity. Just look at the CEO in boardrooms of large companies as a good example. They're not massively diverse at the moment. And so we're going to have this piece, presumably in your thinking, is we are going to need different styles of leadership and different types of people running companies to be able to deal with the challenges you're talking about.
Yes, and we do have different styles of leadership. I mean, CEOs of quoted companies are not all cookie cutter people. There are very many different types of leadership, and we've moved a lot from the kind of very hierarchical top-down organization to much more of the networked organization with self-managing teams and all these sorts of things. So those things have changed quite a lot. So, but yes, I think that the thing about an era of political capitalism is the fluidity of it all. That's something that, if and this is a challenge, if you're trying to make a decision as a corporation on a big investment that's going to give you a payoff in 20 years, maybe, and that the political winds are always going to change, that culture is going to change, etc., then those decisions become that much more difficult. But the flip side of that is that if one learns how to think in a political way, you can discern the direction of travel, even if it's not clear. You can discern which direction things are going, even though they're going to waver from one side to the next, 1 year to the next. So I think that the opportunity lies in what I call developing acute political antennae within organizations. Actually being, they say in politics that the successful politician is the one who can capture the spirit of the times. And the spirit of the times evolves. So I think, corporations need to develop these political antennae to understand the socio-political cultural environment within which they're operating, and understand it in a soft way, not trying to put it on a spreadsheet, not trying to sort of do it by doing market research on 10,000 people and tabulating the results. That's not going to get you very far. It's all more touchy-feely. So how do you develop within a corporation that ability to sense out there through your antennae what's going on and which way the winds seem to be blowing? And those are things that can be developed, and companies have done it in different ways. So, for instance, years ago already, Intel put together a team of about 50 or 100 anthropologists who would go, fan out across the world and come back to explain to management and to explain to the corporation the interaction between human beings and technology. So, it's those sorts of things that companies need to develop.
And so, in essence, this is almost the equivalent of things like the Brexit vote or Trump getting elected, which if you'd asked the quote-unquote experts, and the polling, I guess, to a certain extent as well, and they were unexpected. And yet, if you had spoken to people on the ground and tapped into that piece, and that's where to your point, those politicians were successful because they recognized there were some buttons to be pressed,
yes,
and a mood that was out there. You've got to be getting into that sort of piece. And so what you're suggesting really is, I guess in some respects, it's going back to the old school thing. So if you're a car manufacturer, is talk to the people in the dealership and the garages who are handling customers, who know how the customers are using the product, observe what's going, rather than thinking about how you'd like to use them.
Yes.
Or talk to your call center operatives, monitor your data, all those sorts of things. So have tentacles out there, if you like, that really give you the true picture of the direction of travel, as opposed to making presumptions in a sort of boardroom or strategic office setting.
Yes, and again, it's you can talk to your dealers who deal with the customers, but heaven forbid, you might even talk directly to customers at some point.
God no, they're awful. Right? Exactly. What do they know?
But getting back to Trump, there are a couple of things about Trump. There's a wonderful chart in the New York Times that came out during and after the election that showed probabilities of winning for Hillary versus Donald Trump. And it was something like 85-90% Hillary running like this all through until election year. And it was all through straight lines, and Trump was at the 10-20% chance of winning. And only at about 3:00 in the morning on election night did the lines, just flip. So nobody predicted it, and nobody understood it. But there's another story that's in the book about Trump, and it's about Harley Davidson. So as you may remember, Trump slapped tariffs onto steel. And in response, Harley Davidson said it was going to move some production outside the US. Now, here you have a company which couldn't be a more iconic American company. And management made what they would have considered a perfectly rational management decision to move some production out of the US. And people were going to lose their jobs in the US because of this. So the Financial Times went to talk to some of these workers. And they asked them what they thought about all this. And the workers said, well, I know I might lose my job, but I think President Trump made the right decision because we have to protect America from unfair competition. So here you see a contrast between the political way of thinking, the intuitive, emotional, identity-based way of thinking. Yes, I'm going to lose my job, but I'm an American and my identity is primarily American, and that's why I work for Harley Davidson, and President Trump is doing the right thing. Whereas management did what they thought was the right management decision. So you can see a huge contrast here. And it's obviously in the short and medium term financial, profit delivery side of things, the financialized way of doing it, moving production out of the US was perfectly rational. But over the long term, and in terms of the brand's identity, in terms of the brand's relationship with its dealers, in terms of the brand's relationship with its own workers, what is going to be the impact on that? But you have here two very fundamentally different ways of thinking, and management is going to have to balance the two. Whereas in the past, it was always the right decision to look at what made the most sense from the bottom line.
And to your point, you can put the extra, what would tariffs cost us? What was the raw material? That goes nicely into a spreadsheet. What will Jimmy Jones, who's working on the production line, think of this? Well, that's much harder to quantify, doesn't sit nicely in cell C27, and therefore historically has been ignored. And I think that idea of tapping into, I've heard it called the Vox Populi risk, which is, asking people what they think. Sometimes you'll get an answer that you're not at all expecting. And what's interesting here is that it's not as if we're tracking weather systems with a degree of predictability. People react to things, yes, and they'll react, and they can be persuaded to react in different ways. And so we're dealing with quite a fluid dynamic. And so I'm struck here that not only do you need to be alert to that, but the monitoring systems that you need, as you were saying, fundamentally different. And the assessment processes for the risk is going to look very, very different, right? You can't quantify some of this stuff.
No.
And yet you need to bring it into the calculations.
Yes. You're going to have to make intuitive decisions. What feels right. And that is something that we have almost extirpated out of business decision making. And to some extent, there's a risk that it'll get even worse, because now we're all obsessed with big data and algorithm-driven decision-making, when we don't even have a clue what these algorithms are doing, and they self-evolve. We don't know on what basis these algorithms are spitting out decisions. And okay, big data is real time, maybe, whereas in the past data used to be, and there's more of it, but it's also much more limited. You only have a certain amount of big data that you're collecting, and it only gives you a partial view of the world. And then you stuff it into an algorithm that God knows what it's doing. And suddenly you get something spat out that says 67 is the answer. And we need to be careful about where all that is going, because it loses a lot of transparency. And this is not only applies to business decision making, but it applies to all of us. When your credit rating is being spat out by an algorithm, whether you have access to health insurance is being spat out by an algorithm, where life-changing decisions for people are being spat out of algorithms that, frankly, we have no idea what they're doing because they're too complicated. So, there's a big danger in this kind of rush to, innovation and technology as the answer to everything. And we need to remember that we don't actually live in a technological world. We still live in a human world, and we're still human beings. And I believe that the companies that go too far down this route, not that these tools are not going to be useful, not that every tool is useful in its right place for the right job. But if you get over-seduced, and if things go too far in this direction, I think it goes against the grain of what I'm arguing is political capitalism, which needs to have a big element of decision-making that is intuitive, that is emotional, that is political in the broadest sense, that is cultural, or in other words, that is human.
And that's interesting because it takes us away from a world of lots of people like models. Lots of industries have developed models for risk and for how to do things. And you say you throw things into the black box, see what comes out, and that's good. That's a number, that's an answer, it's quantifiable. And there's some smart things going on in the box that I don't fully understand. Doesn't matter because some smart people have looked at this. And as you say, we don't know. But there are there's lots of examples of industries. Financial services would be a good one where we have leaned on these models for some time. And we saw in 2008, the flaws in some of those models that, as you implicitly point out, there were human dynamics at play that were sort of not visible to those models and not understood. And so I think that's an interesting point, in that the more data that comes out, the more temptation there is to go down the model route because that feels safe and quantifiable. On the other hand, the alternative world that you paint of the sort of gut feel intuition, that is potentially very personally risky because you really are sticking your neck on the line. If you get the model out of the way and you say, I don't care, I'll look at what the model says because it might be interesting, but I'm going to potentially ignore that and do my own thing. That feels like a huge amount of risk on the stewards of business that they may not have been used to taking. And so this for me is a fascinating thing because you're really shifting the risk profile for the people sitting at the top of businesses in key decision making, where they are literally having to come up with things that are based on their own gut instinct. It's taking decisions in a way they may not be used to doing and may not be comfortable doing.
Yes, it's the models are still going to be useful in their place. And everybody knows that there is no perfect model. Everybody knows that all models are, very, very crude approximations of the world. And it's foolish to believe everything that's spat out. So I think in my view, it's not a question of concentrating decision making on the leaders of business. It's a question of the leaders of business finding ways to get multiple inputs into decision making and multiple diverse inputs. So if you have a board of directors, all of whom have had the same career, the same background, the same upbringing, have been through the same types of businesses so that they have deep subject matter knowledge, etc., etc., etc. That board of directors cannot make good decisions because it's too monocultural. There's I can't remember his name now, but there's a Dutch management thinker who said every leader needs a fool. And by fool, he meant the equivalent of the court jester. Somebody who would be out there saying, as it was with court jesters to the all-powerful king or to the CEO, this is bloody stupid. This is not going to work. You're getting it all wrong. In corporations, it's very hard to accommodate that sort of thing. Again, driven by efficiency. So if everybody is monocultural and comes out of the same cookie cutter, decisions get taken very quickly because nobody dissents, or there's not much dissent. Once you start putting together teams of people with different backgrounds, different cultural beliefs, different value systems, and different ways of seeing the world, then it's not very efficient, but it's much more resilient.
It's fascinating you talk about court jester. So I interviewed a lady called Beatrice Otto, who specializes in looking at the fool. And we talked on exactly that subject of saying this is a missing piece of risk management that, what's fascinating about it is, and to your point around tapping into the human, so what we're taking here is something that was created centuries ago, that even then in less complicated times, they recognized was worth having. And I wonder, as you were talking, it struck me that actually in our rush to modernize and be more efficient, we may have left some other things on the table that could actually be fundamentally useful. And I wondered if in your sort of research you'd come across other examples of things that perhaps we should bring back or do differently that we could learn from sort of almost sort of what feel like less sophisticated times, but many of the methods they use might be more appropriate for what you're talking about.
Yes, and I think one of the things that we have, some people have forgotten, is that efficiency. The more efficient you are, the less resilient you are, and the less sustainable you are. Because efficiency, efficiency just, leads you down a narrow path. I mean, take agriculture. We talk about modern agricultural methods, which are hugely efficient. You can get a lot more crop per acre than you could before with a lot less manpower, because now you have machines, you have tilling methods, you have all sorts of things. Well, I don't know the last time you've been on an agricultural farm that has used modern agricultural methods for a long time, but you stick your hand in the so-called soil and it's dust. It has nothing left. All the nutrients have been sucked out of it. It's been very efficient for a while, but now it's highly inefficient, because now you have to buy expensive chemical fertilizers because your soil is dead. And I was at a management, giving a talk at a management meeting some time ago, and I made this point that efficiency, comes at a cost of resilience and long-term sustainability. And I was amazed by how many of the senior executives said, "What do you mean by that?" It seems to me obvious, but it's no longer obvious because efficiency has been the religion.
And I think that's interesting from a human capital perspective as well, because there is this view that if I can get people to work longer hours, so if you take banking, for example, we pay people a load of money, and then investment banking, and let's get them to work ridiculous, lawyers, let's get them to work ridiculous hours. And the bit I find amazing, one, we shouldn't be surprised that people burn out. Two, when you're tired, you are more likely to screw stuff up. So the number of big decisions that are taken at 3:00 in the morning just because, well, we have to, it's not. It makes sense from a utilitarian perspective, value for money, but it's absolutely absurd. And I think it's not surprising that we have lots of people with mental health issues, that in many cases companies aren't as creative as they might have been. And the bit that really gets to me is we hire people, the interview process, a lot of companies is, so tell me about yourself. And they're interested in your what do you get up to in your spare time? And then, I like going to theatre, I like playing sport. Oh, good, excellent. We want those sort of people. And then they work you so hard that you have zero opportunity to do those things in the role. And you wouldn't do that in any other context. And I find this, I completely agree with you. It's it might look good from an output perspective, but actually you're potentially destroying some of the real value that's in there and not thinking through the whole picture of what you've got and how you can nurture and build it forward. It's very, very short, and it's back to that short-termist thinking. So it bothers me hugely when you say that people don't understand it, because I agree with you. To me, it's blindingly obvious that doesn't make sense. But I guess if your mindset is in the one you've talked about them being in, maybe we shouldn't be surprised.
No, we shouldn't be surprised. That's been the culture over the last 20, 30, 40 years, maybe even before that, in the industrial era. Squeeze as much productivity out of it. And our metrics push us in that direction. So everybody measures productivity. And how do we measure productivity? Well, we measure it by output per man hour worked. So, it's all focused on efficiency. It's all classical and neoclassical economics, which is well out of date and has been, and is very damaging if you take it too seriously. Now, it's got useful insights to add, but one mustn't take these things too seriously. And back to what you said, it's all a question of your time frame. Over the short term, sure, you can, create a lot of supposed value and certainly generate a lot of money and be very productive. But over the long term, it doesn't work. There's a line in the book, and I can't remember exactly how it goes. But they talk about I quote somebody who talks about the centennials. And the centennials they define as companies that have been around for 100 years and seem like they're going to be around forever. And they talk about the characteristics of these companies. And the characteristics of these companies is that they don't focus on short-term performance. They focus on how they can make the world a better place over the long term. And it's just a different mindset. But in the 1980s and 90s, that kind of mindset was squeezed out. And as I said, it was the age of financialized capitalism. But I think it's coming back. And I think that, we realize that a lot of the things that we value as human beings cannot be put on a spreadsheet. They cannot be measured in pounds, shillings, and pence, but we still value them. So we have to find some way of, changing how we do business and how we live in the world to encompass the multiple things that we value and that our society values that cannot be measured. And those are essentially political questions, which is why I call it political capitalism.
Fascinating. One final question for you, because we've talked around, I guess we've, I was riffing off a little bit about you're looking at things from a different angle. And we've obviously looked at it from the angle of organizations, companies, and society. But if we look at it from the angle of the individual, one of the things that this also does, if your predictions come true, and I agree with you that this looks like the direction of travel, that the nature of what work means and careers mean could be very, very different because there's almost a different tune being played. What would your advice be to people who are, particularly, I guess, younger listeners who are trying to start thinking about this, who still have a career ahead of them? What can people do to prepare for these particular dynamics? Because it seems to me that it's a different environment, and therefore one may need to have different skills, a different way of looking at what a career means. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I believe that the younger generation already has these somewhat different values and are less inclined to buy into what I call the 1980s and 90s financialized values. But I'll give you an example of what I believe is a perfect, in the context that you've just laid out here, a perfect example of the generational change between financialized capitalism and political capitalism. So I was on another podcast some time ago, and we were talking about this, and the person I was talking to said, well, it's interesting. He said, because whenever I used to go and say to my parents and my grandparents, I've got a new job, or I'm thinking of applying for a new job, they always asked the same question, which was, how much are they going to pay you? So then whenever I went to talk to my friends or people younger than me and told them I've applied for this job or I've got a new job, they asked, well, is it a satisfying job? Is it useful? Is it socially useful? Is what you're going to do valuable? And that, if you like, is a perfect generational transition between the financialized world and what I call the world of political capitalism.
I love that. It's so nice it's that way around, not the other way around. But that's fascinating. Joe, I could keep talking to you because you've set so many sort of thoughts running through my head. So before I say thank you to you, can you remind my listeners what the book is called?
The book is called The New Financialized Capitalism, with the subtitle of How Business and Societies Can Thrive in an Increasingly Polarized World.
Fantastic. And I will put links to that in the show notes and a few other things that you're involved with, Joe, so people can track you down and read more a little around that.
Yes, and if they want to read more about the book and about some writings, some additional writings, there's a website up called New Political Capitalism, one word, newpoliticalcapitalism.com.
Fantastic stuff. Well, look, thank you for writing the book. And as I mentioned earlier, I got to know you through a comment you posted on LinkedIn that I thought was incredibly perceptive and set my mind racing. This conversation has taken me a lot further. So it's been an absolute pleasure to have my brain exercised, but I've also thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. So thank you so much for being an amazing guest on the show.
It's been a great pleasure, and good luck with all your podcasts, which seem to do very well.
Thank you. So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Joe for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Joe's book, The New Political Capitalism, have a look in the show notes. There's links to that there. There's also a link to the episode I talked about featuring Beatrice Otto, talking about the role of the fool as a risk manager. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To find out more about human risk and the work that I do with my clients, helping them mitigate theirs, visit human-risk.com. That's also where you can subscribe to the Human Risk newsletter. I'll be back with another episode of this show very soon. But in the meantime, please stay safe and thanks for listening.